everyone, and welcome to our webinar on MIPS optimization. I'm Dr. Andrea Brault, President and CEO here at Brault Practice Solutions. I am an emergency physician, but have spent the last 20 years on the business side of healthcare, and also along the way got a master's in medical management from USC. Here at Brault Practice Solutions, we started out 30 years ago focusing on our acute care specialists and helping them understand their revenue cycle. But over the last 10 years or so, we've also been helping our various hospitals, ACO partners, and physician groups understand how to optimize their scoring and financial benefit through these various government programs. And also here with us today is Mr. Jay Fisher.
So hello, my name is Jay Fisher. I'm one of the partners with C3 Partners, where I've been active with MIPS and macro since 2017 and quite honestly well before in the predecessor programs. The role that I fulfill here is helping to understand all the details of the regulations. I mean, literally it's thousands of pages, hundreds of pages at a minimum every year, thousands of pages. Getting through that content to try and figure out what matters and why it matters, and how we use it to drive strategies and how we use it to drive technologies, I think are a fascinating and interesting part of what we're able to do with macro here.
And also with us today is Ms. Leah Mauson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Mauson, and I am the Executive Director of Integrity, Education, and MIPS here at Brault. My passion for MIPS has really started back in the days of PQRS and HEDIS, where I was responsible for working with our providers and educating them. I have continued that here at Brault, where I work with our providers on analysis and really giving them the opportunity to maximize and optimize the program.
And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And I think, Mr. Fisher, you have the first slide.
I think one of the things that I like to start with when I'm talking with people about macro, and by now most of us have some experience with macro, right? I mean, we're all, those of us who've been in ambulatory practice or have had ambulatory practices have been submitting macro for several years now, since 2017. I think that the message that I like to start with, though, is what we know about macro, what we learned about macro from 2017, quite honestly, through the end of next year, 2021, is by no means representative of what macro will be in the longer term. And I say longer term starting in 2022 and every year forward, since there's no explicit sunset. What makes that first 5 years different is that CMS intentionally wanted to make sure that the macro program as passed by Congress was going to get full participation by all or almost all physicians in the country, and that the program was successful in driving quality performance up and costs down. So they wanted to have not only good participation but also good performance across the program. And the method that they used to do that was they created this transitional ramp-on period, 2017 through 2022, and during that period we had lower performance thresholds, meaning in order to avoid penalty and start earning money, you needed a lower score. And we also had easier scoring rules, meaning that it was easier to achieve a good quality score or a good cost score or a good improvement activity score for hospital-based providers. What's happening in the longer term, those transitionals were set to be very, very easy in 2017 and a little harder the next year and a little harder the next year, and working up towards something that approaches what we expect the full-on macro to be. The problem with that approach, though, has been that from the very beginning, providers, because macro was essentially PQRS and meaningful use and value-based programs that we already had, providers were familiar with it. So we had very high participation. Almost every provider in the country participated in macro from the first year. And performance has been very good as well. That means that a big part of macro reimbursement comes from a pool that Congress defined as revenue neutral, or we can call it the penalty pool as well. And almost no one contributed to that pool. In fact, what we know, 2018 is the most recent year for which CMS actually published aggregate scores. They did in 2017 as well. And 2018 is interesting because in 2018, the mean, or just the straight average score, was about 82.8 points across all providers, this reporting as groups. The median, meaning half of the providers in the country scored at or above it and half scored below, was 95.2 points. So the scores have been very, very high. What that means is that in a year like 2018 that had those scores, only about 3% of the providers in the country paid penalties. No money in the revenue neutral pool to distribute. In 2019, it was even worse because people who had poor performance were able to claim a COVID exemption, and I found there was only about 1% of the providers in the country had COVID exemptions. What we're going to see is going forward, those numbers are going to get much, much bigger. The bottom line will be is that there's a lot more risk with half of the providers in the country theoretically being penalized, and those penalties driving a lot more money available into the performance pool. And I think Leanne's got a nice example that we walked through with a hypothetical provider group.
Thank you, Jay. What it sounds like is we're moving from the carrot to the stick. And for our audience, if you're over this program or responsible for planning, these next couple slides will provide some information and some tips. So Leanne, I think you're going to take us through a financial example.
So for a financial example of a modest-sized group, around 250,000 visits and 20% Medicare reimbursement, 2019, as we just outlined, with COVID, 1% of our providers receiving penalties. Really, the only reimbursement or incentive that we saw was for the exceptional performers. That incentive rate was roughly 2%. Which relates to around $126,000 for about $6.1 million Medicare payment a year. But as Jay mentioned, as the years continue up till 2022, it's going to be a little bit harder, but there will that will result in a higher bonus pool. So for 2022, we have a base threshold that increased by 15 points of 40 to 45, and our bonus threshold is also increased to 85 points. As we look through, if we have an assumed MIPS composite score of 90, which sounds pretty good, we would achieve a 2.2% financial achievement, resulting in $137,000 roughly in change. We're leaving on the table about $50,000 almost. In 2020, it's still going to be a little of a strange year with COVID and those exemption applications as well. We're probably not going to see as much penalties as originally assumed. In 2021, though, COVID should be over. We would hope our base thresholds are going to increase again. Our bonus thresholds are going to stay the same. So if we look and we keep that same MIPS composite score of 90 points, we're going to see achieved financial percentage or your incentive percentage at 6.3%, which would be a $386,000 MIPS incentive. With a 90 point, though, we're still leaving almost $80,000 on the table. So optimization, I would say, is key, trying to reach that 100 points and grab everything that's left on the table. If we take a look down at 2022, we do have our full MIPS program. With that being said, the law that's put in place for the full program is there has to be probably about 50% of providers that are going to be receiving penalties. So there's going to be quite a bit of penalties in that budget neutrality to feed those incentives. Looking through, we have a base threshold of 74 with a bonus threshold that increases to 92%. Our annual max or annual base incentive will be about 9%, but with your bonus threshold, you could receive 19% incentive given you have above a 92%. So 100 points, 100%, you could theoretically see 19% incentive in 2022. If we take a look and see at a 90 point composite score, let's keep it consistent across, we will have a 12.9% achieved financial percentage or incentive. And looking at our MIPS payments, it's $790,000. We still are leaving that percentage on the table, though. We're leaving about $376,000 on that table.
Thank you, Ms. Lawson. And for our viewers, we can put this together with relatively few data points. So to the extent that you would like help understanding what your potential financial upside is, you can reach out to Mr. Fisher or Ms. Lawson through email, and they would be able to help you with that. And I think, Mr. Fisher, you have the next slide.
Given the kind of those interesting numbers that Leanne just walked through, a couple of the big observations that you might have had would be, as we get out of the transitional period, the threshold, the bar that you've got to jump over gets higher. And it starts to approach the performance that people have actually been achieving, right? But I think one of the other things you might have noticed in that display was we showed CMS is projecting a mean or median performance threshold of around 74 points. Well, gee, if 2018 our scores were in the high 80s and low 90s, why would it be that CMS is expecting scores to go down as a result of full-on macro coming in place? Pretty good question, right? So there's a few things that we know of that are going to happen when full macro rolls out, and probably one of the first and the heaviest hitters of these is quality measurement. So in quality measurement for hospital-based provider, once we're into full macro, can be 50%, even up as high as 85% of your overall score. So it matters a lot how well you do on quality, depending on the characteristics of your practice and your physician's patient volumes. So what happens in quality in 2022 is two or three things. First of all, one of those transitional rules that we followed from 2017 through 2021 is that if you submitted anything at all for quality, you got credit for it. It could be a horrible score. You could have the worst score in the country, and you're going to get at least 3 points on any quality measure you submitted. And quality measures, generally speaking, have a maximum of 10. So anything at all gets you 30% of the way there, right? Well, as of 2022, all quality scoring is going to be based on a full decile ranking, so that if you score in the bottom 10% or the bottom 5% of providers in the country, you're going to get a score that gives you 1 point or maybe even a fraction of a point. So all of the floors go away. The ability to report quality on only a portion of your measures, we call that the case minimum or the data completion percentage, gets much more rigorous starting in 2022. One of the other things that gets more rigorous is benchmarking. Quality measures, so as you probably know, quality measures are based on a fundamental in numerator and denominator, the numerator being what percentage of the time are our providers compliant with a given protocol or quality practice, and the denominator being what patients, what cases contribute to that, and so you get a resulting performance rate. Well, a performance rate of 90% might sound pretty good, but based on the way all providers in the country are scoring in a given year, if everybody's scoring 92 and better, your 90 is going to only get you maybe a 1 or 2 point score. And for sure, what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years of the macro program is quality benchmarks do indeed become much more rigorous. So not only is it going to get harder to score based on the benchmarks, but the minimum score goes away. You can get a 0 or a 1 or a 2. And the other thing is that there's a lot of quality measures that providers in general have been submitting. We'll call them sort of the easy quality measures because they're practices that are mature. You've done them for a long time. You've always done well on them. Those measures are CMS is pulling them out. They're pulling a batch of measures out of the population every year, quite honestly, making the population of measures from which you can choose those that are going to be maybe less familiar to you and a little harder to be compliant with. So that's going to be a big driver in pushing scores where that median score might have been an 88, pushing that median score down to what CMS is projecting to be for 2022 in the middle 70s. The other things, though, is that the threshold against which we determine whether we're going to get penalized or rewarded. So the aggregate of all of your quality and cost and improvement activities scores, the MIPS overall composite score, is going to be increasing to that number that CMS has yet to define. They get to choose at the beginning of the year. They don't get to choose during the year, but they get to choose at the outset of the year whether they're going to use mean or median, and they'll be making that decision for 2022 sometime early next year as to which metric will be used for the full on MIPS year. Now the problem, one of the things that will be a challenge for a lot of us is that so far in terms of MIPS, every year at the beginning of the year, in fact, almost 2 years in advance, we've known what that performance threshold will be, right? We knew at the beginning of the program that you had to get 3 points out of a possible 100. We knew a year ago that for 2020, you'd have to score 45 points to avoid penalty and to start earning money. Once full MIPS rolls out, those numbers are, do we say artificial or arbitrary? Those are numbers that are predetermined by CMS in their goal to make an easy transition from the beginning of MIPS up to what we expect to be the full-on MIPS. So they created kind of a gradual progression of scores, and you would know in advance of each year what your score needed to be. Starting in 2022, that's not the case. Starting in 2022, that MIPS performance threshold, or the aggregate performance threshold, is calculated based on all of the scores that are submitted for that for a given year. And it won't actually even be published probably until June or July of the following year. So we'll be able to tell what our score is, but we won't yet know what a good score is. Now, I think there's some practical matters and some workarounds and some estimates that you can do to help working around that. But I think the practical implication there is we've all got to do as well as we can to a relative standard, but we don't know what that relative standard is going to be, which means we just have to shoot for very, very high performance. It's not only the base performance threshold for avoiding penalty, but the high performance threshold. Leanne talked about the kind of the super highway of MIPS funding for those providers who score incredibly well, the high performance pool. That number is determined each year under the full on macro, whereas in the past years it's been another number that CMS has pre-published, 75 points this year, 85 points next year. What that number is going to be is based on a formula each year that says we're going to start with what's the performance threshold that was the median or mean that CMS is going to determine, and then we're going to take 25% of the way between that score and 100 points, and that's going to be the high performance threshold. So figuring out what the high performance threshold is going to be and where you have to be to earn money is going to be another thing that's going to be a little tougher to predict. Having said all that, though, again, I want to reiterate once more that the reimbursement increases should be dramatic. I mean, by the time, if we're working with going from, we managed to get maybe 1 or 2% positive adjustments in the last couple of years with 2 or 3% of the providers in the country being penalized. Imagine what that's going to be like when we get 50% of the providers in the country being penalized. Now, CMS sets ceilings on what those MIPS financial adjustment percentages could be. The practical ceiling for a perfect score under full-on MIPS is 19%.
Thank you, Jay. If you could go back and help the audience understand, I'll confirm my understanding. So starting in 2022, by law, half of the providers will receive a negative adjustment.
It'll be very close to that. It depends on which method CMS elects to use. They can choose to use either the median, which by definition would be half of the providers in the country would be penalized, or they can choose the mean, which is just a simple average. In the last 3 years, the mean has been slightly below the average. So the number, it could be half, it could be a number slightly less than half. It's going to be a big number.
So I think a lot of our audience members have either not invested a lot in optimizing this program, and they've seen very little happen as a result, or we have some audience members who have worked very hard to get a high score and also seen not much of a positive financial adjustment. So if I'm understanding, in the performance year of 2022 or the payout year of 2024, we will see some dramatic swings in those numbers.
Yes, and hopefully, CMS has tried to structure the program so that 2021 starts to ease us up toward that. I think 2021 it's still going to be a transitional year. It's going to be similar to 2017 through 2020, but a little bit better. But 2022, watch out.
And I believe you also have the next slide on beginning on ACOs.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that as we've studied, the regulations, particularly the proposed rule on MACRA coming up for 2021, a lot of our hospital clients have TINs, either some or all of their TINs involved in ACOs. And ACOs relative to MIPS have they've kind of made MIPS easier for their providers. I mean, a provider who's part of an ACO up until 2021 CMS would use a quality measurement technique called the CMS Web Interface, which really means that the quick answer to that is that all of the member TINs had the ACO create their quality and submit their quality measures for them. Pretty nice deal, right? I mean, they had CMS's strategy was, well, every ACO has to report quality anyway, so let's make sure that we use the data that we're already reporting for another to eliminate extra work. Well, starting in 2021, that CMS Web Interface is going to be sunset. It's going to go away. CMS is offering some other options, so providers will be able to submit their quality measures under the MIPS CQMs or or registry, either eCQMs coming out of their EHR if they have EHRs that are certified for that, or by using a registry, or using a new technique CMS defines as the APP, the APM performance pathway. Part of the problem with this is going to be that for those providers that are ambulatory providers, not too hard. Most ambulatory providers use EHR technology that's already certified to generate MIPS quality measures. Right? So they'll have to start doing something that they've not done and submit those measures on their own or with the help of a registry or another third party. But basically, they'll have all the technology in place to do so. They probably don't need to do a lot of extra coding. They probably don't need to do a lot of coder education or provider education to do that. Should be built into their ambulatory EHR. Problem comes with hospital-based providers. A lot of hospital-based providers, while they might build Medicare Part B, they'll tend to not have EHR technology that's certified to the CMS ambulatory standard. They'll use the hospital's EHR, and might be great for what they do for their clinical practices, but hospital-based EHRs are not certified to produce MIPS quality measures, not certified to calculate the measures and not certified to submit the measures. So the problem is going to be for those hospital-based providers that the ACO is no longer going to be able to submit their quality measures for them. They're going to have to come up with another method to submit their quality measures. CMS requires that the submission of quality measures for MIPS be done using certified technology. Since hospital-based EHR is not certified for MIPS measures, those hospital-based providers are going to need to look elsewhere to get certified technology. And in today's market, almost all of that elsewhere is certified registries and QCDRs. Now you might say, well, what about this new APM or this new APP standard, right? We can submit to the new APP standard, which is built specifically for ACOs, and there's a lot of that's easier. So if you submit to the normal MIPS standard, you've got to submit 6 measures that are relevant to your practice. Under APP, you've got to submit 3 measures, and they're easy ones. They're standard ones, right? They're diabetes, A1C poor control, they're preventive care for depression, and controlling high blood pressure. The problem is you've got to find some certified technology that's going to generate and submit those measures for you, and you've got to go to a registry to get it. So from the point of view of what's different starting in 2021 for hospital-based providers that are part of an ACO, right? In the past, we've been able to say, ACO's got us covered. We really don't need to do anything. Not true in 2021.
So Jay, if I'm a hospital-based provider, how transparent has this transition been? And if it wasn't transparent to me before, what should I be doing now?
Well, CMS has a lot of different venues by which they share information with providers or share information with registries or QCDRs. This particular topic is published in the 2021 MIPS proposed rule. It's published in the Federal Register, but, if you're a person who follows healthcare additions to the Federal Register, there's thousands of pages each year, and how do you know to pick this one out? So it's proposed rule. It's not final rule yet. We expect to see final rule published probably generally sometime in the November timeframe, and at that point, I would expect to see this issue of the sunset of the CMS Web Interface being much more common knowledge, but I think you're right. I mean, this is it's something. It's not exactly a hidden problem, but you have to be really on your toes.
And where should the audience be looking to see if this proposed rule or this proposed change is actually written into the final rule?
Well, for those of us who have to download and read the entire final rule, you can pull it out of there. That's boy, oh boy, that's tedious. I mean, that's literally 100. I expect this year's final rule probably to be less than 100 pages on macro, but it's still 100 pages of pretty dense reading. CMS, I think they've done a decent job on the QPP portal, on their website, about publishing summaries of the final rule. One of the other places that I tend to look if I were an ACO is look to your trade association, the NACOs, or the National Association for ACOs. I've not yet seen NACOs take a position on this, although they probably will between now and actually in the next week or so, as CMS is starting to close out the comment period on the proposed rule. So I think with ACOs, even beyond what is coming up in the MIPS proposed rule and hopefully the MIPS final rule for 2021, for providers that are particular hospital-based providers that are or have been part of ACOs, there's another series of changes starting back in 2019. There's another series of changes that are driving hospital-based providers to have to take a closer look at MIPS, maybe invest in some new relationships to be able to be compliant with MIPS, in order to take advantage of the money that Leanne was talking about, and avoid some of the penalties. One of the biggest things that's happened in the ACO world is in 2019, CMS published new regulations saying that every ACO in the country, and at that point there were, I believe, just north of 500 ACOs. Those ACOs were required at the end of their 3-year contract period to enter, to make a choice to either exit the ACO world altogether or enter into a new contract that would require that the ACO take two-sided risk. Why is that different? In the original set of ACO regulations under which the vast majority of those 500 or so organizations were working, most ACOs could choose to enter into an arrangement that would allow them to share in savings, right? To share in savings defined as an ACO incurring patient costs that were below a threshold. And if they're sufficiently below the threshold, then some of that savings CMS would write a check back to the ACO, and the ACO could have decisions on how they distribute those checks back to the providers. Pretty good deal, right? Well, if you wanted that check to be bigger, that percentage of shared savings to be bigger, you could enter into a two-sided risk arrangement. Now, under the two-sided risk arrangement, though, you've got to kind of set aside some money, because at the end of the year, as the ACO, if your performance is worse than that benchmark, you've got to give money back. It's not just a withhold. You've got to actually give money back to CMS. Well, most ACOs chose to not enter into that kind of agreement. They accepted the more modest upside risk. But starting with the 2019 rule, any ACO that renewed their contract had to enter into an agreement that while they might not have to enter into two-sided risk on day one, the contracts were extended to 5 years. And over those 5 years, you had to move gradually into accepting a two-sided risk arrangement. What happened is some ACOs chose to not, to actually not participate. And in fact, we did an analysis of all ACO member TINs in 2019 and then again in 2021. And what we found was that in 2019, about 3,600 TINs or groups chose to not renew their ACO membership, or the ACO elected to not have them, to not have them participate. In 2020, the number got a little bit bigger. It was almost double that. About over 6,000 TINs chose to not participate in ACO. Now, during those years, there were some new groups and new TINs that came in, but there's still a net reduction in the number of physician groups that were participating in ACOs. Some of it because there were fewer ACOs. Some of it because the groups elected out, and some of it because one of the things that the ACO Association and ACOs have determined is that hospital-based ACOs that have a high hospital-based membership tend to be a little less likely to achieve shared savings and a little more likely to incur losses. So one of the strategies that we can infer from this, I can't say exactly because we've not interviewed everybody, but one of the strategies that we can infer is that hospital-based providers are a little less likely to be involved in an ACO starting in 2019 and 2020. So that's the regulatory background. What are the practical implications? Well, if we think about what are hospital-based providers, in the context of this kind of discussion, it's hospitalists, ED providers, radiologists, and a little bit of anesthesiology and pathology. Any of those providers that have Medicare Part B, that Part B billings. So, if you've been a hospital-based provider under one of those definitions, and you've been part of an ACO, the ACO is taking care of all of your quality reporting for you, just like we got done talking about with the 2021 changes. But even starting in 2019 and 2020, we're having a number of hospital providers who are no longer affiliated with an ACO, but are not yet accustomed to doing their own quality measures. They don't have the infrastructure, the technology, the coding people, the billing support to be able to even calculate their own MIPS quality measures, much less submit them. So the problem we talked about with 2021 providers having to actually, hospital-based providers in particular, having to make investments in new relationships and new technology, that problem exists already today and even a little bit last year with providers who may have exited ACO because of the 2019 rule sets, and ACOs that are renewing their contracts. In 2019 was the first year, 2020 is the second. By 2021, all ACOs will have renewed contracts under that 5-year cycle. But a number of them now are, a number of our hospital-based people that we see are starting to have to evaluate new ways of doing things if they want to take advantage of macro penalty avoidance and earnings.
So, Leanne, if I'm a hospital-based provider, is there a place I can go to understand if I'm still part of an ACO, or are there things I should be doing right now regarding my quality measures?
So on the QPP website, if you have access to your yourself on there as a HARP account, you can look and see exactly where you fell last year, points-wise, your feedback from the ACO or your MIPS, depending on where you've been. You can take that route. You can also go on the QPP website, even if you don't have your own HARP access, and check eligibility. They do snapshots throughout the year that actually check your eligibility to see where you stand within the MIPS program. So as a part of an ACO, there are requirements that physicians have to meet based on patients and things like that. And if you don't meet those requirements, CMS will deem you as a partial QP. Well, a partial QP means that you are not eligible for that 5% ACO incentive. So checking that QPP website and your eligibility can help you really get a feeling for, am I a part of an ACO? I think I am, but I'm not sure. It will tell you exactly if you are and what status, if you are, you're at. So you can be a advanced qualifying physician or an advanced QP or a partial QP.
It's important to note those statuses can carry, as Leanne inferred, either to the group or to the individual provider. So even though you might think that you're part of an ACO, as individual providers, you need to take a close look as well.
And I think, Leanne, we've also seen examples where the group level TIN is part of the ACO, but some of the individual providers below that did not qualify.
Yes, so that's exactly it. We've seen groups that are a part of an ACO and they're geared up and ready to get their 5% ACO bonus the following year, however that comes in, and they ask, okay, so where's my status or anything like that, and they go into the QPP website and check their eligibility and find out that 50% of their physicians are not going to receive that bonus because they're partial QPs or have such a low volume for, let's say, their part-time physicians that they're not even considered a part of that ACO. So there are those situations as well.
You know, one of the thresholds that I didn't mention, but I should have mentioned when we were talking about MIPS getting tougher. One of the thresholds is the threshold at which providers qualify as ACO QPs. At one point, up until 2022, you could get away with maybe 50% or fewer of your patient visits being qualified. But starting once MIPS is in full-on MIPS, that 50% or 25% threshold bumps up to 75 or 70%, and it's going to be harder to achieve. More people will fall out.
So in discussing the ACOs and changes for 2021, kind of carrying this on to all physicians, we do have our quality benchmarks. They're not going to be published in advance for 2021, so we can't, so to speak, check on our benchmarking against our scoring and things like that. So normally the 2020 CQM benchmarks would be based on the 2019 performance. Due to the impact of COVID, they won't be publishing those. They can't really put that into play because of that automatic exemption that they put forward in 2019. Benchmarks will be determined based on that 2021 performance and submissions. As Jay was explaining for 2022, how that won't be brought out and you won't know your actual score because of benchmarks until that feedback. That will be how 2021 is. We won't know that until after the performance submission has been finalized. Our final benchmarks and our macro quality scores, they won't even be known again until that June, July of 2022, I believe in around July. So there is one thing that we can do to kind of get ourselves an idea of our benchmarks, because CMS isn't going to be publishing those and we won't be able to look at the historical benchmarking. Large registries can offer real-time benchmarking to their provider population, and they can take their entire population and benchmark that out. Where is everyone sitting? Provide those benchmarks, and that can get you, that will probably show pretty close to what CMS is going to come out with in that June, July 2022 period. Another change we have in 2021 for all physicians is that our MIPS value-based pathways, or MVPs, are going to be deferred until 2022. Our penalty threshold will be 50 points. So it'll be easy to beat, but you still need to give some action and put some optimization into it and focus on that. As we know, it will be increasing. And even though we haven't had that incentive drive as we saw in our financial projections, we will in 2022. So practice makes perfect. Always try and improve, try and get that 100%, that 19% incentive. And our positive earnings will require better than 85 points. So that bonus threshold, or our super highway, it is increasing to 85 points in 2021. So from 75 points. So
thank you. Does the deferment of the MVP program affect hospitals mostly, or hospital-based providers? Who's impacted by that?
So when they proposed the MIPS value pathways, it really looked geared more towards our ambulatory providers, our office-based physicians. There wasn't a lot that they proposed, at least, that looked like it was for our hospital-based groups at the moment. But the real answer is we aren't sure yet, because they gave us a shell of what it was going to look like, but didn't give us the actual look of it. So based off of what they've previously said, it's not going to really impact our hospitals at this moment.
Got it. Thank you. And I think we have one more slide, Leanne, that you're going to walk us through.
Yes. So how do we optimize? How do we get that 19% incentive come 2022? I believe that when we hear all about the MIPS and everything, we really want to focus on our reporting and our analysis throughout the year. Again, practice makes perfect, and understanding where you're sitting, especially in your key area. What is the category that's getting us the most points? That category is quality. So really paying attention to our quality. Choosing the right registry and QCDR that fits what your needs are, I think, is key. And we have to remember that registries and QCDRs are obligated to provide feedback during the year. But as we've noticed, most of that feedback is very passive. We want very action-associated reporting. We want to know how to improve and really identifying our shortfalls, helping us understand where we can improve, understanding where we're falling behind it. And our areas of focus is key to optimizing for the full-blown MIPS program. Understanding the regulatory impact and that analysis, as Jay mentioned, 100 and some pages of very dense regulatory information on MIPS might not be something that everyone wants to review. And really identifying, again, as we said, most of us are going to have to choose a registry or QCDR. Getting that for what you're contracting with those registries is really key, because they can take care of all of that registry or regulatory stuff for you. Remittance reconciliation, and this is essentially looking at your financials. In 2019, we were said to get 1.79% incentive in 2021. So outlining all the incentives that come from Medicare through the remittance advices, and keeping that in line, and then just validating that that's exactly how much we're supposed to get. I know that we have seen that it wasn't exactly what was expected, and then understanding that it wasn't what was expected. What's my impact? We don't want to get hit with, if it was an overpayment recruitment, that takes a lot of work and a lot of time. So an analysis that can identify that and not kind of sneak up on you and hit you when you aren't expecting it is also something we want to pay attention to. So we also have our improvement activities. Now, improvement activities up until 2020 have been relatively easy. We've only needed one physician to perform one activity and move on from there. But in 2020, we have to have 50% of our group. So it still is relatively easy, but we really need to make sure that 50% of our group is doing this. So starting in June, having these discussions, choosing our activities, and the documentation. It's also new this year that we actually have to audit that documentation and make sure that activity is being performed. So getting to understand the documentation that you're going to need for that audit, and then ensuring that your 50% of your physicians are doing these activities for a 90-day period throughout the year really is going to help you optimize, because improvement activities are that easy 15 points that you can receive. One of my favorite topics and discussions is on CQM, or our quality measure improvement. So we really want to focus on analyzing our data at a level of an individual physician. Even if you're going to submit as a group, we want to look for those high and low performers for insight. If we have those low performers, we can take that and really identify, is there some kind of nomenclature or different language that physicians using are not exactly lining up with what our coders are looking for, let's say from the specifications from CMS, and identifying those issues, and then fixing them. So on a monthly basis, getting reporting and looking at high and low outliers, and identifying areas of improvement and verbiage for each, and understanding exactly what we're looking for in measures so we can easily meet those is really key to optimizing our quality. And of course, when all else fails and we can't find those differences and everything else, we're going to look for providers that are just maybe not compliant. They're not using the education and the resources that they've been given to meet those measures. So they're not saying that the reason I gave an antibiotic is because I suspected it was bacterial. Just things like that would really help optimize, as we've seen in the financial impact and discussed this entire session. We're really focusing on optimizing for that 19%. Everyone wants to be above that possible 50%. None of us want to get penalties. So optimizing and getting us there is really key.
Thank you, Leanna. I think this is our final slide. And for those of you that watched this webinar, if you have questions, our emails are attached. A reminder again that we're happy to help you put together a financial projection, as well as find some of the websites that we referred to and some of the resources that we referred to. Thank you.